The FBI sting, the device used on members of Congress, is still being used far beyond Congress, even reaching into the executive ranks of the mafia. Those in the blue suits, pointy black shoes, white-on-white shirts, silver ties, and smoked glasses. This time beginning in Louisiana, and now the FBI and grand juries are investigating. Brian Ross tells all about it.
Metairie, Louisiana. This is the home of one of the richest and most powerful leaders of the American Mafia, Carlos Marcello. The man in this gray sports car is a Marcello bodyguard, circling the block, apparently to make sure it is safe for Marcello to leave his house. Moments later, Marcello appears. At age 70, Marcello is said to be one of the most active and ruthless mafia dons in the country, and for years he has been able to go about his business with little trouble from the law. But last year, federal authorities say, just like the congressman in Abscam, Marcello fell for an FBI sting. A sting that has now led to a widespread investigation involving corrupt state and local politicians, big labor unions, the Coca-Cola Company, and a bribery scandal in Washington. This is where the FBI tricked Marcello, at his own office in the back of a motel near the New Orleans airport. For more than a year, Marcello met here with men he thought were crooked insurance agents, men willing to pay him huge bribes to get government and labor union insurance contracts. The crooked insurance men were really undercover FBI agents who are said to have recorded payoffs to Marcello and learned a lot about how Marcello and the mob do business in this country. One major part of the FBI investigation involves Marcello's ties with federal officials in this Washington building, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Marcello was supposed to have been deported from this country 27 years ago. This is a copy of the Immigration Service deportation order declaring Marcello an undesirable alien, issued in 1953. But somehow, Marcello has managed to stay in the country all these years.
Racketeers have moved on.
The only serious effort to enforce the order came in 1961 when Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, personally ordered Marcello flown out of the country to Guatemala. But Marcello, within a month, sneaked back and has been fighting deportation ever since. The FBI is now investigating whether in the last few years Marcello was getting help with his problems out of this office, the office of the Deputy Commissioner of the Immigration Service. Under investigation is the former Deputy Commissioner, Mario Noto, who resigned last October. A lawyer for Noto said Noto had done nothing wrong and is cooperating with the FBI. The FBI is said to have recorded Noto's phone conversations with the man who lives in this house in Washington, the man federal authorities say is Marcello's fixer and payoff man in Washington. He is I. Irving Davidson, who calls himself a Washington arranger and says he is proud of his long friendship with New Orleans Mafia boss Marcello. Federal authorities say Davidson will be indicted along with Marcello on racketeering and bribery charges. And authorities say Davidson not only works for a mafia boss, but is also under investigation as a Washington payoff man for one of the country's biggest companies, Coca-Cola. This is Ian Wilson, an executive vice president of Coca-Cola from South Africa. Federal authorities are investigating whether Marcello's man Davidson paid a bribe to an immigration official to clear up problems the Coca-Cola executive had with the Immigration Service, problems that could have kept him from working in this country. Federal authorities say the official suspected of taking the bribe is this man, M.J. Babe Shihai of the Immigration Service. Shihai would not talk to us about the investigation.
Talk to my lawyer. Talk to my lawyer.
Mr. Irving Davidson?
I heard of him.
Any relationship between you and Coca-Cola, Carlos Marcello?
Nothing.
You cooperating with the FBI now? Talk to
my lawyer. See my lawyer.
Shihai's lawyer says that Shihai has done nothing wrong, that Shihai does know I. Irving Davidson, but that Shihai did not take a bribe from Davidson to do a favor for a Coca-Cola executive. At Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta, a spokesman said I. Irving Davidson works as an occasional consultant for Coca-Cola, but that the company could not comment further because of the FBI investigation. An FBI investigation that now involves the Coca-Cola Company, an alleged payoff man for the Mafia, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and all started by an undercover sting on Mafia boss Carlos Marcello of New Orleans. Grand juries in Washington, Houston, Los Angeles, and New Orleans are now investigating, and the first indictments are expected in the next 2 weeks in a case federal authorities say will show the enormous influence of mafia boss Carlos Marcello in American business, labor, and government. Brian Ross, NBC News.
Louisiana, the state we're in. This week, we're devoting our entire show to an examination of the FBI's investigation into an insurance kickback scheme that has implicated a number of Louisiana officials. The code name given for that FBI probe is BriLab, short for Bribery Labor. The first stories on this investigation came out of Los Angeles, where a Justice Department organized crime strike force was looking into corruption of union health and welfare insurance plans. This was a sting operation, similar to the one operating in Washington, where agents posed as wealthy Arabs and reportedly caught a number of congressmen taking bribes. In the Louisiana case, the FBI agents were posing as prudential insurance agents, and reports indicate their entree into Louisiana's political circles was reputed mafia boss Carlos Marcello. It's been reported that a number of political leaders in Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana took payments in return for promises to use their influence in obtaining city or state health insurance contracts.
Beth, the first stories on BriLab broke late last Friday night. By Saturday, several newspapers were quoting unnamed Justice Department sources who claimed that at least 2 former candidates for governor may have been involved in that kickback scheme. The newspapers also reported that the key to the FBI sting operation was a Beverly Hills insurance promoter and underworld figure named Joseph Hauser. The FBI used Hauser to infiltrate Louisiana's so-called crime syndicate, which reportedly led him to a number of important politicians. But in a state that just wound up a multi-million-dollar campaign for governor, many of those named are already saying that they simply thought the money paid was a campaign contribution. What we do know about the BriLab story at this time is at least 13 state officials, including Governor Edwards, have been called to testify before a federal grand jury. The campaign records of Edgar Mouton, Louis Lambert, Jimmy Fitzmaurice, and Bobby Freeman have all been subpoenaed, along with state campaign records. And records of the State Employees Group Benefits Program have been subpoenaed. The center of the investigation is now New Orleans, where a federal grand jury began hearing testimony on Thursday, and it's at that point that we pick up our story.
At this time of year, most news stories in Louisiana take second billing to Mardi Gras festivities. But this week in the heart of New Orleans, the crews may still be rolling, but the attention was focused on the federal courthouse, where a parade of state officials came to give testimony before the federal grand jury. The first to arrive on Thursday morning was Governor Edwards. Scheduled to testify at 9, he spent most of the day testifying before 2 separate grand juries, one hearing testimony on the BriLab investigation and the other examining a 1975 campaign contribution to the Edwards campaign for governor. Campaign officials for defeated gubernatorial candidates Sonny Mouton, Louis Lambert, and Jimmy Fitzmaurice all arrived at the court, bringing with them the financial records of their candidates' recent campaigns. Lieutenant Governor-elect Bobby Freeman came to give his testimony, but was reluctant to talk with reporters.
And I'm here to cooperate with whatever the grand jury or the United States Attorney wants.
Many of those subpoenaed did not have a chance to testify Thursday. Louis Lambert, scheduled to testify at 1, was told to come back the following week because lengthy testimony was delaying the proceedings. Lambert's attorney, Camille Gravel, did tell waiting reporters that his client had met with Joseph Hauser and there had been a campaign contribution of $10,000.
When was that?
Well, I mean, that's something that is willing for everybody to know, but we don't feel like, in view of the fact that there is going to be testimony, that's going to have to be at least later on. He'll be back a week from today that we should say anything further, but because of the statements in the press in that precise area, I think it is appropriate for you to know that Mr. Lambert is not denying that particular matter at all. It was a campaign contribution for the purchase of tickets to a fundraising fair. I don't know the exact details.
Second primary.
I don't even know that. It was in sometime in November.
How many tickets?
Lambert said he felt pretty good despite the bribery allegations and media attention that he said had probably put an end to any possible appointment to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Reporters continued their wait on the steps of the courthouse most of the afternoon for any further witnesses, but it wasn't until 4 o'clock that Governor Edwards emerged to give his account of what went on inside the grand jury.
I can tell you that from no one involved in this BriLab situation did I receive any money. I can tell you that since September 1st of 1979, the state's insurance program has been in the hands of a committee formed by the legislature at my urging and under a bill which I signed, and that at no time since that committee was formed have I made any effort at all to contact any member of the committee to influence any decision that it had relative to the state's insurance program. I can tell you that as late as October of last year, the Attorney General ruled that the committee would have to advertise for bids, and that the committee has been in the process of preparing the specifications. It has always been understood by all the committee that the advertisements and the awarding of the bids would not take place until after my term as governor had ended on March the 10th. I can tell you that I did meet with a man that now has been identified to me as Joseph Hauser. We met at the mansion. I spoke to him head up. It is obvious to me that the conversation was recorded. I do not have any concerns about the recorded conversation, although I did not see a transcript of it.
How did you come to meet Joseph Hauser?
I met him at the request of Louis Lambert in the middle of November of 1979.
At the request of Louis Lambert, what did Mr. Lambert tell you about Mr. Hauser?
Well, that, of course, would now get into that phase of my testimony involving others that I do not think would be a right thing for me to do at this time. I just prefer to wait until they decide to themselves say what happened or didn't happen, or until whatever action the Justice Department will make in this will come down.
Did Mr. Lambert ask you to do any favors for Mr. Hauser?
He did not. He just asked me to talk to him and discuss the possibility of campaign contribution. We had there were 3 or 4 elements of the conversation. To be very honest with you, although he identified himself as a Prudential insurance agent, it did not take me long to ascertain that he was not an insurance agent. I had reason to believe, and I will not tell you how, that he had underworld connections, and therefore I was very careful with the way I talked to him, guarded in my conversation. I played games with him. I led him to believe certain things that I thought he wanted to believe. I did not know at the time that he was wired in playing games with me, but we were playing games with each other. When I got through talking to him, because I was very concerned about what his motive was, where he was coming from and where he was going, because it was obvious to me that he was telling me things that didn't make sense and were unrealistic. I had a brief meeting at some subsequent date with Bo Garrison, the Superintendent of State Police, and with Judge Reggie, my executive counsel. And we agreed that if the man did come back in order to try to nail it down, whatever games he was playing, and remember, I did not then know he was an undercover agent, we were going to arrange to record the conversation ourselves. We'd have had kind of a double sting going. But as I said before, he never got back.
Did he ever tell you that he gave money to Mr. Romer?
No, he did not.
Did the name of Mr. Marcello come up at all in the conversation?
It did.
In what context?
I would prefer to let that come from other people.
What did he want in return for?
Well, that was part of the difficult thing to understand about the conversation. He talked about the state insurance program, and I asked him, well, what are you interested in? He said, well, we want to bid, and we're going to be low bidders, and we're going to save you $1 million. And I said, well, man, you got no problems. It's going to be bid. The Attorney General has said it's to be bid. A committee is handling it. I haven't contacted the committee, and I do not intend to, and I have not. If you're the low bidder, I'm sure you'll get the job. He said also they would save $1 million, and I said, well, that's very good news.
But Edwards said he became suspicious of that deal when Hauser offered $50,000 a month in payoffs.
Because he was talking about $50,000 a month in cash, and that equates to $600,000 a year. And anybody who knows anything at all about the program knows it doesn't generate enough money to pay off anybody there.
And that was the crux of the thing that tipped you off.
That was one of the several things that convinced me that this fellow's not for real. I don't know what you're doing here. I said to myself, I don't know what you're trying to get at. I don't know who you're trying to embarrass or what your underworld efforts are, but one thing is certain, I know you're not on any legitimate deal to work something out on insurance because your figures are way out of line.
And that $50,000 wasn't just for you, but was for everybody?
Edwards said offers of this sort weren't that unusual, although in this case the sums may have been larger. But the governor said he was confident that the evidence would show he had done nothing improper.
One person who has figured prominently in news reports on BriLab, but who has not been subpoenaed to appear before that federal grand jury, is Commissioner of Administration Charles Romer. He has acknowledged meeting with FBI informant Hauser, and newspaper reports say that Romer accepted at least $15,000 from that undercover agent. Romer served as a fundraiser in the Bhutan gubernatorial campaign, but has refused to comment on those stories.
Ron, testimony continued today at the federal courthouse with a grand jury hearing from some of the members of the Board of Trustees of the state's health insurance program. Also scheduled to testify were Lieutenant Governor Jimmy Fitzmaurice and State Senator Edgar Mouton. Earlier this week, U.S. Attorney John Volz said the subpoenas issued so far may be just the beginning.
Let's put it like this. The number today is insignificant as to what will come.
U.S. Attorney John Volz giving a terse summation of a case which may well turn out to be the most far-reaching investigation ever undertaken by a United States attorney in Louisiana. Volz, flanked by FBI spokesman Harold Helterhoff and Eld Eads Hogue, the chief of the Organized Crime Strike Force, also told newsmen today that the highly secret BriLab investigation would extend far beyond the 4 southwestern states mentioned so far in the investigation. And Volz said he would have preferred if the probe would have remained secret.
Frankly, had the system worked the way that it was designed to work, we wouldn't have to do this, but it hasn't. So I think we need to keep in perspective the fact that no one has been indicted, and that we should all be very, very careful about inferring guilt or any illicit involvement on the part of anyone until such time as a grand jury has acted in this matter and any persons charged have been afforded due process of law.
Volz added that as a result of the disclosures, the undercover phase of the operation would be halted, but the FBI field work would continue. The U.S. attorney said he expected the grand jury investigation to last several weeks. He would make no predictions about indictments. All 3 men at the news conference were extremely cautious in their remarks, emphasizing the fact that no inferences should be drawn from the news leaks surrounding the case. At his news conference, U.S. Attorney Volz was asked about probable charges from defense attorneys of entrapment by federal agents.
We really can't comment on any possible defense. Really, what you're saying probably has some merit in that entrapment is a legitimate defense, which is raised in many cases. Without trying the case in public, which we obviously cannot do now, we just can't answer that.
But did you start to go after these politicians, or did your investigation start somewhere else?
We didn't go after anybody. The opportunity presented itself. The FBI did its job. The strike force did its job. The U.S. Attorney's Office did its job.
Both the FBI's abscam operation in Washington and the BriLab sting in Louisiana shared some common characteristics. They involved the spending of huge sums of money in pursuit of corrupt public officials. They involved agents using con game tactics, and they involved the use of elaborate fronts and undercover setups.
The story sounds like something out of an old spy movie. FBI agents working undercover in a suburban New Orleans motel. United Press International reports say that FBI agents stayed in the Travel Inn motel on Airline Highway, a motel that overlooks the offices of Carlos Marcello, a reputed underworld crime boss. That office is located behind the Town and Country Motel, and from their rooms the FBI agents could view the Marcello building. According to UPI, the FBI used that room for videotaping and electronic bugging during the probe. Reportedly, the agents rented the room since August in the names of Hartley and Hartley. 4 or 5 men were said to have stayed in the rooms, mostly keeping to themselves. On Saturday, when BriLab broke, the men were gone, and both the motel management and the FBI has declined to comment on whether the rooms were in fact used for surveillance on the reputed underworld figure. At Marcello's office, a staffer refused to answer any questions and told reporter Nancy Weldon that Marcello was not expected in.
No, we haven't seen him at all. He hasn't been in at all today. We don't expect him in either.
Marcello's attorney in Washington, Jack Wasserman, says he's aware of some vague stories involving Marcello, but he says he knows of no wrongdoing on the part of his client. During the BriLab undercover investigation, some FBI agents posed as sales agents for the Prudential Insurance Company. Prudential spokesmen acknowledged that they gave health insurance plan information to the FBI, but they deny any knowledge that they knew of the FBI sting operation. In New Orleans, Prudential officials would only say that when the story broke on Saturday, they were as surprised as anyone. One of the reasons why there was so much confusion about this story when it broke last weekend was the fact that Louisiana's group insurance program has already been the subject of a great deal of extensive investigation. Charges of corruption and fraud weren't anything new, as we see in this report, based on a story we presented last summer.
80,000 state employees and 198,000 dependents are protected under Louisiana's group health insurance plan. It is a $50 million a year operation that is run through a complex series of private contractors in conjunction with the state. The benefits provided through the program have not been questioned, but the administration of the program has been at the center of a great deal of controversy. Last summer, a special legislative committee was formed to look into the management structure of the program, after a number of state representatives, including V.J. Bella of Berwick, complained that, among other things, claims processing had fallen months behind schedule.
We've heard a lot of allegations Friday that came before our subcommittee about administration expenses being hid in the group insurance program's budget, and we heard of cost-plus contracts, open-ended spending. We heard of splitting of insurance premiums. We heard of employees being hired to administer the the sheriff's program in the state group insurance, and the state picking up the tab. We heard of employees from the DOA's office that's being paid out of group benefits. We heard a lot of allegations that day, and what I've done this morning.
As legislators looked into the program, they found that group health was being managed by an intricate tangle of private consultants. At the top of the group insurance management pyramid was the Division of Administration, which organized the program in 1973. However, in charge of the actual day-to-day management was the Continental Assurance Company, or CNA. CNA, in turn, contracted for computer services with AdServ, a California corporation. CNA operated the system on a cost-plus contract for $18,000 a month plus expenses, which amounted to $1 million last year. During the month-long series of hearings, lawmakers heard a number of allegations concerning the management of the program. They were told that the state was locked into costly long-term contracts that cost millions. They heard allegations that AdServ was formed merely to move state workers out from under civil service. They were told that an accountant in the health insurance program was instructed by top administration officials to hide millions of dollars in expenses. They heard charges of insurance fee splitting on extra insurance coverage offered by the plan in violation of state law. And the lawmakers heard allegations that contractors were running up lavish expense accounts which the taxpayers must eventually absorb. The first person to bring up the numerous charges was Hubert Linscomb, a manager in the group health plan. After Linscomb went public with his charges, he was fired. Also joining Linscomb in charging mismanagement was Bob Dornblaser, the former manager of the plan for the Division of Administration. Nevertheless, as the investigation began to gather attention in June of 1979, Governor Edwards dismissed the complaints as sour grapes.
There's some hearsay testimony by disgruntled employees that got fired. That isn't serious, nor is it an accusation. To the extent that it is, the Legislative Committee will continue its investigation, and if any substance is found in these statements, then of course I will address it. I do not have any reason to believe that there's any evidence about the insurance program. These same legislators that are quick to grab headlines by making irresponsible charges are the first ones to call us when the claims aren't paid.
Although Governor Edwards said that both men acted in retaliation for being fired, Bob Dornblaser said he didn't resign until after his complaints were ignored by the Division of Administration and the governor.
Eventually, I went to the governor on March 23rd this year. I met with him at the mansion and went over the problems with him.
And what was the response?
The governor told me that he would look into my concerns and that he would get back with me.
Of course, we heard in testimony the governor this week told a committee that disgruntled employees were making lodging complaints and they should have worked within the system before. How did that make you feel?
Well, the only thing I could think is the governor had some misinformation, first about being fired, because I was not fired, I resigned, and second, that he had forgotten about our meeting that we had in March at the mansion.
Now,
Gentlemen, the purpose of my appearing here is not to defend the program or to defend Joe Terrell or to defend Charlie Romer or to castigate any of the disgruntled ex-employees who suddenly are privy to all this horrible information that they kept locked in their bosoms during all the months they were on the payroll. The purpose of my...
On Tuesday, June 19th, Governor Edwards again responded to the insurance probe. Appearing before the House Appropriations Committee with Division Administration Chief Charles Romer, Edwards asked the lawmakers to hear both sides of the story. However, he made it clear that Romer and his assistant Joe Terrell were the men responsible for the program.
And I think in fairness, before people rush to judgment and make statements like we've been had, before the other side is heard, that you ought to listen to everybody involved in the program. We may have been had, and I'm not going to say here today we haven't been had, but I don't think any member of this committee knows any more about the program than I do. And I'm going to tell you now, I'm not in a position to affect the judgment. There is only one certainty that I'm going to make, and that is you're not going to find any violation of any rules or regulations or any errors on my part. Maybe people with whom I had trust and confidence will be found with sticky fingers. I don't believe it and have no reason to believe it, but I have no concerns at all about it. And I appreciate the fact that some of you have expressed some concerns to me, but don't concern yourself about it. You use a big hacksaw, get in there, open up the jungles, see what you can find, and I assure you any reasonable recommendation you make to making the program better, I will adopt.
The legislature did act on the matter, taking the program out from under the direct control of Charles Romer and his assistant, Joe Terrell. By September 1st, the entire structure was reorganized with a 10-member board of trustees overseeing the state employees benefits program, and things were supposed to change. The Attorney General ruled last November that the contracts with Continental Assurance Corporation, or CNA, were illegal because they had not been awarded by public bid. The Board of Trustees has not at this time selected another company, but was in the process of drawing up specifications for a new contract. And it is that new contract that may be the focus of a grand jury inquiry. The executive director of the Board of Trustees, James McElvin, and several other board members have been subpoenaed to testify in New Orleans on Friday before the federal grand jury. The FBI has already expressed interest in knowing if anybody had put pressure on the board to consider any specific insurance company. McElvin and his staff spent most of the day gathering records for the grand jury appearance. McElvin, who's only been with the crisis-ridden program since September, said he was taken by surprise by the federal subpoenas, and he likened it to a man waiting for a friend on a corner and being hit by a train. And with more developments in the federal government's BriLab investigation, all 4 men indicted in the year-long FBI undercover operation pled innocent in federal court this week. We have this report from New Orleans.
Reputed underworld figure Carlos Marcello was the first to make an appearance at the federal courthouse in New Orleans this week as he arrived with attorneys to plead innocent to the charges of racketeering, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Marcello had little to say to reporters, except that he found his legal troubles to be very tiresome. Also appearing before the federal magistrate Tuesday to plead innocent were Washington public relations man I. Irving Davidson and New Orleans attorney Vincent Marinello. Joining in the innocent plea on Wednesday was Charles Romer, the former commissioner of administration under the Edwards administration. In addition to filing his plea, Romer also asked for dismissal of the charges on the grounds of prejudicial news coverage stemming from government leaks. A tentative trial date for all 4 men has been set for July 28th, although it is likely that the trials will be separated.
Back at the state capitol, lawmakers approved in committee this week a bill that would create a commission to investigate wrongdoing in Louisiana's elections. The Elections Integrity Commission is the concept of Governor Dave Treen, and he personally urged approval of the commission before the House and Governmental Affairs Committee.
Charges of vote buying have plagued many of the recent elections in Louisiana, and the House of Representatives decided on Thursday that if you're caught and convicted of vote buying, you should face some tough new penalties. Under the new law, bribing a voter would be a felony with a $1,000 fine and a year in jail. They came to the federal courthouse in New Orleans. Governor Edwards testified before the federal grand jury hearing the BriLab case, and then told reporters that yes, he had met with the FBI's undercover agent, but no, he hadn't taken any money or done anything wrong. Louis Lambert testified, and then his lawyer told reporters that he took a $10,000 campaign contribution from the FBI's agent, but said no deal was made in return for the money. Lieutenant Governor Jimmy Fitzmaurice didn't do any testifying. He took the Fifth Amendment, saying he needed more time to study his records. BriLab has fallen on Louisiana, and it's the topic of discussion on this month's Reporters Edition of Louisiana, the state we're in.
In recent weeks, state news has been dominated by one major story, the BriLab investigation. This FBI undercover operation looking into insurance kickback schemes has produced thus far a federal grand jury investigation and a host of headlines featuring some of Louisiana's best-known political figures. With me to discuss the BriLab story and its political implications are three Capitol reporters: Bob Courtney of WBRZ-TV in Baton Rouge, Bill Lynch with the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and John Hill of Gannett News Service, owners of the Shreveport Times and the Monroe newspapers. Gentlemen, this story first broke the evening of February 8th. Most people found out about it in a story published by the Los Angeles Times, and when they picked up their Saturday morning newspapers with headlines featuring pictures of some of Louisiana's officials and commentary such as FBI bribery probe involves important figures in Louisiana. Were you all taken by surprise, as I was? That seemed to be the reading on that.
I think a lot of people were taken by surprise. I know I was. I was at home, about ready to go to bed, and the station called me and said, some story is breaking. It involves the governor and Louis Lambert and Jimmy Fitzmaurice, and you better get down here. So I did and read the wire. I didn't know anything about it until I started seeing what started developing over that Friday night and then the resulting Saturday morning. And then, of course, I think maybe there has been some criticism of the fact that the Louisiana news media was not in on the story. In fact, Jim Levy, who worked in Louis Lambert's campaign, who writes a column for the Bunkie Record, sent me a copy of his column. He did a column on, saying that how it took everybody by surprise. And I think it took a lot of people by surprise, if they're completely honest. It was something that broke in another state. That's where the developments took place.
And that other state, of course, was California. Bill, what's the background on that? Why the Los Angeles Times? Why are they doing this story involving all these people in Louisiana's politics?
Well, obviously the sting operation was created by an FBI operation that was established in Los Angeles, California, and operated primarily through a man named Joseph Hauser, who was an insurance agent of some sort. Hauser's had been in the insurance business in Louisiana in the past, and they used him not only in Louisiana but in Texas and in Oklahoma and I think even in New Mexico. So it was not unusual that it would come out of California, primarily because the operation itself was based there. They even maintained a headquarters in Beverly Hills, California, and they represented themselves as a private consulting insurance organization with ties to Prudential Insurance Company. So when we heard about the story, and incidentally I heard about it, it was obviously a nationwide thing because my first information about it came from the Washington Post, for whom I do some work. And it was on that Friday morning, and they called me and said, hey, your governor's in trouble down there, and can you tell us what's going on? And the nearest conclusion we could come to that it involved something to do with the state employees group insurance contract, which had not been let, and which was supposedly going out for bids. And we batted that around for a while, and then sometime during the evening here came the Los Angeles Times, I guess it was, Los Angeles Times, with a very definitive story. And of course the whole thing began to just break nationwide. As you know, the BriLab thing is an aftermath of Abscan.
In this case, they weren't posing as wealthy Arabs, they were posing as insurance agents.
Well, apparently wealthy insurance agents.
Insurance agents. I think it took some of the principals involved in this by surprise too, John. Weren't they all in Washington? That's one of the ironies.
Yes, they were up there for the Louisiana Mardi Gras ball, and there was the ball was to be Saturday night, but on Friday night there was a big dinner dance affairs, or dance, reception, and they were all there. And the Washington reporters for Louisiana newspapers brought them the news, and as one guest who was there said, it spread like a tidal wave over this crowd at this affair. And Louis Lambert was there and left early the next morning to come back to Louisiana to find out what was going on. And most of the principals involved and attorneys who are now involved all congregated in New Orleans on Saturday night and on Sunday. And there were all kinds of meetings and with lawyers, and there was telephone communication back between these meetings and these principals on it, and they were trying to figure out what the whole thing was about. They didn't even really know exactly for sure. The only thing they knew is that they had all met with Joseph Hauser, and that Joseph Hauser was the person who served as the FBI informant in this undercover operation.
And of course, there was a feeling that obviously there were tapes on some of these meetings. And the next stories, there were stories coming out daily almost on this, little bits of information in various newspapers. And Bob, I think the first time I got a real taste of it, and TV was really focused in on it, was on the steps of the federal grand jury the day we camped out and watched everyone come and go. That was an unusual gathering, I think.
Another one of my favorite media events is staying outside of a grand jury to watch people go in and out and then ask them what they said and have them tell you they can't tell you what they said, except in the case of Edwin Edwards, who told us everything that he said and recounted most of his testimony. That was a very interesting day because there were a lot of people there. This scandal, or whatever you want to call it, this controversy, this sting operation, has touched a number of politicians. The thing that I find that is interesting is in the beginning, when the story first broke in the Los Angeles Times, and then there was a story in the Washington Post that Saturday, I believe, there were all these statements about Edwin Edwards is not a target of the investigation. Federal sources say the case against Edwin Edwards is weak, but yet, regardless of what they said there, Edwin Edwards was the main focus of attention apparently before the grand jury. He apparently testified probably longer than anybody else, and members of his staff have been called back to testify.
And Bill, certainly your newspaper did a story that has upset the governors, saying that he might file suit about it, saying that Louis Lambert had been offered immunity if he testified against Governor Edwards.
Well, of course, over the years, we've done a number of stories that have upset the governor for one reason or another. And, this thing, you know, the whole investigation continues to evolve. Saturday morning, after the initial story came out, I was lucky enough to reach Charlie Romer on the telephone up in his plantation at Scopina. And he had just arrived from Houston, Texas. And I started apprising him of what was being said in the newspaper, and he said, well, he hadn't had a chance to read the papers, but he had heard something over the radio while he was coming into Shreveport. And I said, well, let me tell you something. We don't have any information right now that you're implicated in this thing, but you may be. And I understand you met with this fellow, Hauser, in Baton Rouge. What can you tell me about him? Well, he did tell me a little bit that he did meet with Hauser in a hotel room in Baton Rouge, and they did discuss the group insurance program. They also did discuss contributions. And he said neither one was connected with the other, and he would not tell me that he had actually received it. As you know, there have been stories since. First he received $15,000, then another $10,000. And of course, the whole thing looks dreadful, just simply going to the hotel room to transact what amounts to both a political and, as he said, state business. They were talking about the insurance contract. That kind of thing shouldn't take place in a hotel room. It makes it look bad in the first place, even if he never did anything, say, criminally wrong.
Of course, it could be said that obviously the idea was this money was supposed to be given to Sonny Mouton's campaign. Charles Romer was functioning as a campaign manager. Senator Mouton, of course, said, I didn't know anything about the money, also to the effect of Charlie Romer spent it as he wanted to. The question point might be raised that a lot of money is raised for campaigns in hotel rooms.
Well, but not if you're saying, well, I met with this person strictly to discuss. They wanted to discuss the state insurance contract, and they wanted to tell me they had a proposal to make, and I was just telling them how to do it. No, that's not the proper place to go to discuss state business. And then in the same breath, you turn around and you start talking about campaign contributions.
One of the interesting things, I think, was that Edwards said there is nothing illegal about promising.
Who was it? Huey Long had said, tell him I lied?
I don't know if that's correct or not.
Well, I've been checked the campaign finance law now. In that portion of the law, there is nothing illegal about promising someone a $5 million state contract in return for a campaign contribution under state law. Now, we might get into some bribery laws, and this is BriLab-Bribery labor. And since we've seen some stories that was not exactly concerned with campaign contributions, but with bribing public officials in their official capacity as public officials.
One must bear in mind that's true.
That's right. So, you know, and nobody really knows what this case is about except the FBI and U.S. Attorney John Volz down in New Orleans.
One of the interesting things, there are a number of confusing elements about this, I think, that we have seen. And on that Thursday, Bob, we certainly thought, as they were going in to testify, various people going in, that there are two grand juries. There is a grand jury looking into the BriLab investigation, and then there is a grand jury looking into Edwards' campaign fundraising. Is that right, Bill? As I understand
That's
it?
my understanding. I just read that in the paper, though.
There are two federal grand juries down there. The question is, which one, you know, they're investigating campaign contributions. One of those grand juries is. And one of them is investigating the BriLab. Now, the BriLab grand jury also may be taking some long, hard looks at the campaign contribution reports and all of those complete financial records of all the candidates, all those boxes of materials that they had to take into the grand jury.
You get back to the old thing that in Louisiana politics, and I think we saw it in this gubernatorial race more than ever before because it cost a record amount of money. Millions of dollars are raised and borrowed by people running for office. And you get back to the old thing that we've all heard before the legislature before. When you start talking about trying to raise $2 or $3 million to run a campaign, you start making promises. You need the money. You start trying to agree with people. If a guy comes up to you and he says, I want to give you $10,000 for your campaign, and I'm an insurance man and I need your help, well, a politician it's very tempting for a politician to say, yeah, I'll do what I can for you, because they want the money. You're not just going to tell the guy, never mind, you know, no strings attached. At least it just doesn't happen that way. And I think what Edwards was saying was there's nothing illegal about lying and telling them you're going to help them. But you do get into the problem of, you know, were you serious? Were you telling a lie? And does it really matter if you lead someone to believe you're going to do things for them in return for money? Is that indeed illegal? Is that a bribe?
That's true. You know, one of the most interesting things that anyone has said to me since this all began came from an ex-FBI agent who said, I can see two sides of this. He said, FBI agents tend to see everything in blacks and whites, rights and wrongs. And I can see the FBI agents in there saying, okay, we're giving this fellow a bribe. On the other hand, I can see the politicians sitting there badly in need of campaign money. All of them were hard up for money and begging for it from wherever they could get it. And the politicians saying, look at this political opportunist. He wants to buy his way into influence.
Take advantage of him.
Take advantage of him. Get his money so it won't go somewhere else to another candidate, and saying, yeah, you're sure, I'll be glad to help you do what I can, you know. So
if we are to understand
possible.
it, though, these conversations have been recorded.
On
so
tape. That's the point I wanted to make, is it depends what's on those tapes.
Well, our governor has already laid some groundwork for what may be on that tape by telling us after his grand jury appearance that he did play some games with Joseph Hauser and led him to believe that he might do certain things and played along because Edwards says he was suspect of the guy from the beginning.
Well,
now, the question is, those games that the governor said he played, could they be interpreted on a tape recording as making promises or accepting bribes?
Bob, you're just assuming that the governor is telling you as a newsman all that he might have said before the grand jury. You made that little comment a while ago that he had told everything to the press when he came out, but you know, I'm not always sure.
He told a lot of things.
Let's say he told us what he said he told.
He was in there over 4 hours, was it?
Well,
He
we
may
don't.
have.
Well, he
Not
wasn't
really sure.
necessarily before the grand
It was
jury
before
for 4
two.
hours because he went before 2 grand juries.
Right.
So we really don't know
how much
long.
time he spent.
One of the interesting things, I think, John, you did a story on this, was the fact that so many people are talking about this. It's not
phenomenal.
just a few leaks, but everyone is talking about everyone else.
I think word hemorrhage is the word they're using now instead of leaks on this. Yes, they are. The targets of the investigation are talking to reporters like crazy. I know they've talked to you, they've talked to me, they've talked to you, and they're telling stories on each other, about themselves, that are derogatory towards each other and that sort of thing. And I just think this is phenomenal.
Well, it might make a good case for pre-trial or pre-publicity.
I surveyed federal prosecutors around the country in California and people who are not involved in either BriLab or ABSCAM and asked them about it. And they said that it sounds like to them that if the targets are, in fact, leaking a lot of this information, they could be setting up later defenses. In fact, they could even attack the grand jury indictments, if there are any themselves, on the basis that there's massive publicity was going on and prejudice the grand jury to indict
But who is responsible for the leaks? I mean, there have been a lot of leaks that could only come from certain places.
Well, the newspaper people, of course.
Of course.
Well, if this is, in fact, a plan to set up defenses, then we are certainly playing right into their hands by printing all this information. There's an interesting U.S. Fifth Circuit Court ruling involving the Burt Lance trial in Georgia that said that a defendant is entitled to a hearing to hold the government in contempt for leaking information to the news media. And there were two tests in there. There were two key tests in there. One was that information was in the news media which was either before the grand jury or would go before the grand jury. And the other is that use of the news media of such terms as sources close to the investigation or sources involved in the investigation are prima facie evidence that the leaks are coming from the government.
I think some of the leaks, of course, have been to national newspapers, or Time magazine, of course, did a story, and I think one of those interesting points out of that was how close Carlos Marcello is to a number of political figures in Louisiana. That was an interesting.
Well, I'd like to see that. That'd be a nice story if whenever they get around to releasing the tape of who all he talked to and what he's done for them.
I would like to hear the tapes of Carlos Marcello and the state officials, if they exist. And I know of two cases, two politicians have admitted having conversations with Carlos Marcello.
Well, I assume at some time the government's going to release those tapes and make good reading.
Well, but you don't think a source close might release it to the picky? We're not anticipating the headlines. One of the interesting things I think people sort of left on the sideline of all this, but involved in ultimately in this, is Governor-elect Dave Treen. He held a press conference just recently, and of course, he made his announcement appointing Lieutenant Governor Jimmy Fitzmaurice to his administration, and only hours after that, Fitzmaurice was on the front page as involved in this story. I think that, how do you think this is going to affect him? Mouton has been mentioned in this, Fitzmaurice also. Yeah. What
that brings up an interesting point, because I traveled with Governor Edwards last week doing a profile on him. And of course, all he is talking about right now and all he's being asked about is BriLab. And we're on the airplane, and I said, well, he was telling me how he did not feel that there was any way that he would be touched by this investigation. He is confident that he won't be indicted. He is confident that even if he were indicted, they would never have a case against him. He's confident that he did nothing wrong. And I said, well, even at that, isn't it kind of a blot on your administration? I mean, you have been called before the grand jury. Charlie Romer has been, one of your top aides, has been mentioned as being involved in the thing. He said it's more a blot on the Dave Treen administration because two of the people who have been called before the grand jury are Treen appointees. Of course, Dave Treen has no involvement that we know of in BriLab, but it does put him in a bad position, I would think, politically, from the standpoint that here are two top people in his new administration, before the ball even gets rolling, who are appearing before a federal grand jury investigating this thing.
He says that it's taken a great deal of his time. He's been very upset about it. The Treen campaign has said they must get the bad timing award for the year for naming Fitzmaurice at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to an executive assistantship to the governor.
And then
the story came out just hours later.
He is evidently being very careful now, though, because he's questioning everyone now.
Absolutely. That's the word that coming down from the Treen transition office is that once they made a decision that they want to appoint someone to a position, they are doing thorough background checks. And as Paul Hardy said, he's questioned him at length about BriLab and any possible involvement. And Treen himself said that it's taken a great deal of his time, that he is attempting to get more information out of the FBI, and of course they're not talking to him, and that's, I understand, disturbing him also.
Wasn't there a complaint about from Bobby Freeman that not all of the gubernatorial candidates were approaching this election?
Yeah. Just today, I think, right. Lieutenant Governor-elect Bobby Freeman, whose name has been mentioned in this and has been called to testify before the grand jury, said he was concerned about the tactics of the FBI if they only went to major candidates endorsed by labor or deemed acceptable, and he was questioning if the FBI was singling out certain people.
It may have been that they were led to certain people.
That's the thing, that, in the original stories they said that it started out as an investigation into bribery involving union, and principally Teamsters, and Carlos Marcello, underworld figures and this sort of thing, and that they were reputed underworld figures, excuse me, and that they were quickly led to state officials. And I think there's a Time magazine story that they have Carlos Marcello on tapes bragging about the state officials that could be bribed. That would be another interesting
Well, that's why I'd
tape
like to
hear.
hear those tapes.
I would like to hear the tapes, too.
That doesn't make it true, you understand.
No, I want to see what's on tapes.
I have a very difficult time accepting anything that, this accusation against Fitzmaurice. Because here's a man for over 30 years has just really been an honorable individual, straight and above board. And, we talked earlier about how did the conversation go? If Fitzmaurice really was involved, because Fitzmaurice has not really admitted being involved in any way, as Lambert has. As I believe Freeman said, he got $1,000 or so. But Fitzmaurice has not said anything. And they're going to have to prove very, very definitively that he took a bribe or was willing to take a bribe for me to accept that.
I asked him why he'd taken the Fifth Amendment, why he had refused to talk to the grand jury. And he said that it was very painful for him to do that. His lawyer told him that he should do that because he doesn't really remember. That's the thing. He doesn't remember taking anything. He doesn't remember meeting with somebody, but in the heat of a campaign, as you were saying before, I think maybe he fears that he did, and he doesn't remember.
Certainly by taking the Fifth Amendment, you don't run the risk of perjury
indictment.
Well, but he damaged himself public relations-wise. But I know Jack Marcello, who is Fitzmaurice's lawyer, and I can readily believe that he would tell him that simply out of being a legal purist. And to a lawyer like Jack Marcello, when you take the Fifth, you're not damaging yourself. You're just
protecting yourself.
Protecting your own interests with those legal guarantees of the Constitution. That's what you ought to do.
That's what it's for.
But for a
does hurt
politician, it is difficult because the people
Very
say, "What are
damaging.
you hiding if you're taking the Fifth?"
Absolutely.
And he said that was true. He saw that as a serious problem.
And I'm sure Fitzmaurice sees that more realistically than Jack does.
Probably so. I think certainly you alluded to the fact, Bob, that Edwards says he's not going to be the fish caught, but he doesn't think this is going to damage his administration going out on a sour note. But it seems that it has taken somewhat of the edge off of it. He can't go out in glory to turn around and come back. I think that he may turn this into an advantage, but certainly in the last weeks there have been some problems for him. In the real estate story you did, Bill.
Well, Edwards escaped popular damage in the Korea Gate scandal, which he was a part of, the Clyde Vidrine exposures, which he was a part of, and he'll probably come out of this just as well.
That's the betting on the streets, I hear, from people in Shreveport, too, who were down here recently. I asked them what's the street talk about BriLab, and they said that they got a bunch of politicians, but they won't get Edwin Edwards.
Did people seem to be still responding when you were on the road with him?
Sure. They crowd around him. They want to talk to him. They want to touch him. They want to be near him. They want to ask him for favors. They want to talk to him about BriLab. He told me something very interesting. He, said that, he is confident, as I said before, that nothing will happen to him and that he won't be damaged by this and that he's done nothing wrong. He said, but what does kind of bother him is the fact that friends of his from out of state and everything see the story and call him and say, this is terrible. I'm so sorry you got caught up in all of this. And his own friends assume he is guilty. People he says he's close to. And he says that bothers him. But he says it comes with the territory, which was an interesting thing. I asked him, I said, well, does it bother you that right here as you're leaving your administration that you have this sour note? And he says, no, because it comes with the territory. He feels that things like this have been going on since he has been governor, and he feels like he will weather this storm. He says they're on a fishing expedition, and they're not going to catch this fish.
One of the things interesting, too, to this, though, is all the people we've talked about, Fitzmaurice, Mouton, Lambert, Edwards, they've all been called before the grand jury. They've all been subpoenaed, but Charles Romer has not been subpoenaed. Have you heard anything more about that?
Sure, a federal prosecutor said that's a sure sign that they have a case against him.
Of course, all we
can do is speculate.
But I mean, you know, that's speculation. But Romer has said many times he's astounded that he's not only has not been subpoenaed by the grand jury, he hasn't been questioned by the FBI.
It could
and he's
mean
puzzled.
two things. It could mean he's perfectly innocent and he's done nothing wrong, or it could mean they consider him a major target and they don't need to call him before the grand jury.
Absolutely.
You know, we don't have any way of really knowing.
A number of people, Harry Hollins, who chaired a special committee looking into the group health insurance program of the state, and Ted Hickey, who is senator involved on this board of trustees, have said they're concerned about the questions that were asked them because they think perhaps the FBI doesn't know as much as a lot of reporters think they know. Have you gotten that impression, Bill, that there isn't a great depth of knowledge about some of it?
Well, yeah, that's the clear indication. And Harry Hollins wasn't really quizzed about the BriLab thing so much as he was quizzed about other aspects of the insurance contract. He was on that original committee which investigated it, and of course he's been involved in other legislative committee hearings. And the questions they have asked him, as far as I can tell, really don't relate, you know, to Romer and to Mouton and to the other candidates, Lambert. They just haven't asked those kinds of questions. And
It's background information, really, isn't it?
The grand jury is trying to acquaint itself with the functions and operations of these various committees, like the Board of Trustees for the group insurance program, trying to understand just how this whole thing came about.
Or how there could be the potential for this kickback.
So that's why you had this mass of people subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury. And obviously there was no implication that these people were doing wrong. Mary Evelyn Parker was subpoenaed and eventually sent her surrogate. And they're not involved in any crooked dealings or anything. They were just brought in to explain how it went.
Of course, we you know, you really have, if you want to be totally honest, you have to say that nobody subpoenaed is automatically suspected of doing anything wrong. It is just an investigation.
Well, and this investigation has a long way to go, I think, and many more stories will be written about it. I thank you, gentlemen. We're out of time for being with me, and I thank you for joining.
But first, this week's top story. The FBI undercover operation known as BriLab produced some indictments in Louisiana this week. That multi-state operation that began by looking into bribery labor ties eventually moved into Louisiana's underworld and political arenas. The story first broke back in February when it was reported that an undercover FBI agent had funneled money into the campaign chests of several gubernatorial candidates. Among the witnesses called before a federal grand jury to testify on the case were 3 unsuccessful candidates from the race, along with then-Governor Edwin Edwards.
Since that time, the story has faded off the front pages. That is until this week when the federal grand jury in New Orleans returned indictments against 4 men. Named in the indictments were reputed underworld figure Carlos Marcello, former Commissioner of Administration Charles Romer, New Orleans attorney Vincent Marinello, and Washington public relations man Irving Davidson. For the details of the indictments, we have a report from Charles Zewe in New Orleans.
The 25-page indictment outlined 52 acts it said supported the charge that Marcello, Romer, Davidson, and Marinello all conspired to arrange and then took bribes in obtaining state insurance contracts from 2 FBI agents posing as insurance men. According to the indictment, which was based in part on wiretaps and tape recordings, the scheme began here at Marcello's Metairie office on June 28, 1979, when the underworld figure allegedly met with Davidson and agreed that they would bribe state officials along with public office holders in Orleans and Jefferson parishes in getting insurance contracts. They also agreed to split commissions 3 ways, cutting convicted insurance manipulator Joseph Hauser in for a 3rd share. But they were unaware that Hauser was at the time working with the FBI. The federal charge says that on August 28, 1979, Marcello and Romer met at the St. Anne Hotel in the New Orleans French Quarter. It was to be the first of a series of meetings between Marcello, Romer, Hauser, and the FBI agents to discuss those insurance contracts. During a September 10th meeting, Romer and an agent go to the men's room, where Romer allegedly agrees to arrange the awarding of a state employee life insurance contract in exchange for a portion of the commission. It is Marcello who later supposedly says that Romer is to get $50,000 a month from the commission, with the remainder being split between the rest of the group. Further meetings followed, according to the indictment, this time at the Baton Rouge Hilton Hotel. In late September, Marcello tells Hauser by phone to pay Romer $15,000, keeping $10,000 for an unnamed person from New Orleans. The same day, the indictment says, Romer accepted $15,000 in cash from Hauser at the Hilton in Baton Rouge. Romer later is to say that the only money he received was a campaign donation for Edgar Mouton, who was running for governor with Romer as one of his chief campaign fundraisers and tacticians. September 25th, 1979, Marcello allegedly describes to Marinello his plans to bribe Romer and arranges for a meeting with Lieutenant Governor Jimmy Fitzmaurice. September 27th, Fitzmaurice is campaigning for governor in the Thibodaux area, but later in the day he is to meet with Marinello and an undercover agent at his New Orleans office. The same day, Hauser purportedly delivers $10,000 to Marinello, who later calls Hauser and Marcello, telling the two men that he has delivered the money to Fitzmaurice. Then on October 4th, Marcello tells Davidson by phone, according to the indictment, "We got two good big shots, man, 2 big shots." But Marcello says he will know nothing until after the date of the gubernatorial primary. A week later, Romer allegedly accepted $10,000 in cash from Hauser, again at the Baton Rouge Hilton. Over the next months, there is further contact between Marcello, Romer, and the FBI agents. Romer reportedly delivered an outline concerning the specifications for the Administrative Services contract. The indictment says Romer gave that outline to Marcello, who then turned it over to the undercover agents. The indictment leaves as many questions as it answers. It provides details on what was allegedly said and done during those meetings and calls, and alleges when and where the money changed hands. But the grand jury released few direct quotes regarding what promises were allegedly made, and it is expected that the tape recordings made by the FBI agents will receive close scrutiny by jurors looking for those promises when hearing the case. There are those who think that this entire case will come down to a single question, and that being, what is a campaign contribution and what is a bribe?
The 4 defendants in the BriLab case will appear before a federal magistrate in New Orleans next week for arraignment, and after that the grand jury will resume its work, and presumably that means that more indictments could be down the road.
The fact that the BriLab indictments were handed down at all was no surprise. In fact, just last week, Carlos Marcello's lawyer made arrangements for his client to surrender when the indictments came down. Almost as predictable as the indictments were the reactions to them, as we see in this report. Former Lieutenant Governor Jimmy Fitzmaurice was the first to respond to the indictments. Speaking to reporters in New Orleans, he said the fact that he was named in the indictments in no way made him a party to any wrongdoing.
I have now had an opportunity to read the indictments returned today by the federal grand jury. As I've always believed, I would not be indicted since I had done nothing wrong. That has turned out to be the case, and I'm greatly relieved. In reading the indictment, however, it appears that I might be called as a witness somewhere down the line. In addition, people have been charged with serious crimes. It would therefore not be appropriate for me to go into detail with regard to matters in the indictment itself. The point that I wish to make emphatically is that no one at any time discussed contracts with me, period. And I made no contact with anybody, no labor leader, no political leader, no insurance person, no one. I've said that from the very beginning.
While Fitzmaurice was talking to the press in New Orleans, former Commissioner of Administration Charles Romer was nowhere to be found. At his office in Baton Rouge, a secretary told reporters that Romer was in town but not available. But at the state capitol, the gubernatorial candidate that Romer had worked for, Edgar Sonny Mouton, was talking freely. Mouton, who now serves as executive counsel to Governor Dave Treen, said that he could not speak for Romer, but that a subpoena was not an indictment, and an indictment was not a conviction.
He has been, is now a friend. And indictment per se, as I said earlier on, only indicates that there is some probable cause to go forward into a criminal trial based upon evidence received. So if Charlie wants to visit and talk on any matter, I will not shun him as a leper because he is a friend.
Senator Mouton, you were subpoenaed. Other people in your campaign were subpoenaed. You said a subpoena is not an indictment. You were not indicted. Do you now feel that you can relax, that it's all over for you, or do you think there's more coming?
Hopefully. No one can predict the federal grand jury. while many people were subpoenaed in my campaign, from my camp, from Lambert's camp, from many camps, and from people not in any camps throughout Louisiana, just based on the whole BriLab investigation, which was very broad-based and covered much more than just a labor racketeer influence, apparently, because once they got into it, they got into other areas. A federal grand jury can continue bringing out indictments. Hopefully they have found that this is the end of the indictments.
On Wednesday, one of the men indicted, Charles Romer, held a press conference in the office of his lawyer, Michael Fowler. Romer denied that he had violated any laws and said that the $25,000 given to him was a campaign contribution to help Sonny Mouton in his race for governor. But the federal indictment refers to that money as a bribe to buy Romer's influence in obtaining insurance contracts and does not refer to the Mouton campaign. Late Wednesday afternoon, Romer visited the state capitol and talked with Sonny Mouton, who prior to the BriLab investigation claimed he knew nothing about the alleged contribution. Romer said that this disputed point may be the focus of the federal government, as well as his longtime friendship with reputed mafia boss Carlos Marcello. But Romer said his guilt or innocence should be proved in court and not in the media.
I don't think I'll be convicted by association. I held the second highest office in the state, and I had the responsibility of talking to all people at that position. I simply think that once we get the trial underway within the court of law, that the whole matter will be abundantly clear that I'm not guilty of anything.
Federal indictments are not federal convictions, but the political fallout from this widely publicized investigation may affect more than the principals involved. Charles Romer's son, Buddy Romer, is running for Congress again, and this kind of publicity is not good.
It's not a good news thing for him, but my son's a mature young man, very capable, and maybe this is part of the test that we have to go through to seek and obtain public office. And I regret that I couldn't have all my acts be such that they reflect honor on him, but my son has to run on his own merits, and he has to simply acknowledge me as a father, but he's not responsible for my acts, nor am I responsible for his.
At present, Charles Romer is the only past or present state official to be indicted. Some are predicting that this may be just the first wave of federal indictments in Louisiana. But as the BriLab case unfolds, the present governor of Louisiana, Dave Treen, says that despite the bad publicity for the state, he and every other citizen should presume those charged are innocent until proven guilty.
Naturally, we don't like it. I don't like it. The people of the state, I'm sure, don't like it. But I think we shouldn't just assume that he's guilty because he's been indicted.
If we turn from a lighter subject to something that's been occupying a great deal of news copy and certainly made a lot of headlines, and that's the BriLab investigation. The FBI undercover operation that has taken place in a number of states and in Louisiana has netted at least 4 indictments, including former Commissioner of Administration Charles Romer and reputed mafia leader Carlos Marcello among those. John, you've been really concentrating on that story, haven't you? Have we seen the end to the indictments, do you think?
No, we haven't. You've got to remember the federal grand jury that brought those indictments is still meeting. They're still investigating. As a matter of fact, this week they subpoenaed Governor Edwards' former press aide, Jane LaBorde-Roussel, for another appearance before the grand jury. Unfortunately, the grand jury could not meet because it didn't have enough people there the other day due to the heat. So Ms. LaBorde said. She does not know why she was subpoenaed, but they're obviously still checking into some Mr. Edwards' meetings with the Mr. Hauser, the FBI informant, and that sort of thing. And there are certain indications that they're still investigating others. And I expect that this grand jury probably will indict. There's a massive amount of tape recordings.
Are we ever going to hear all those tape recordings? They're all going to come out in court? I mean, they're
probably not. I don't think that's possible because I think we'd be in court for about 2 years just listening to tape. And so I think it's going to be selective into the acts of crime that are alleged in the indictment. There are 31,609 telephone conversations that were wiretapped. An undetermined number of consensual tapes, that is the FBI with the hidden bug under its lapel conversation. Some of those last 3 hours, we were told. And an undetermined number of videotapes, too. It's just a massive amount. The judge in the case, Judge Maury Sear in the U.S. District Court in New Orleans in court yesterday, said the case does not appear to be very complex to him at all. But that it is a very unusual case in the sense that there's such a massive amount of evidence to be reviewed by the defense attorneys.
Seems to me that we pushed back some of those dates, though, when the trials are coming up. Haven't we seen that?
Already, yeah. The trial is now set for February 2nd, 1981. Judge Sear says he intends to stick to that, but he says that it may take the defense attorneys 4 months to listen to those the tapes that the government has as evidence. And he told those attorneys that they may be sitting there listening to those tapes 7 days a week, but he was going to get this trial because he felt it was also in the public's interest to have the trial as soon as possible.
When the indictments first came down, there seemed to be some speculation that the second round would follow quickly, and I think that was before everyone knew there was such a massive amount of information. Do you have any feel for how long it may be? Or?
No clue. Who can second guess a grand jury? I don't know. You know, maybe there are a few other things.
Oh, you're second guessing them by saying there are going to be more indictments.
I expect there will be.
Yeah.
They're still investigating. They're still investigating. I'm also, from talking with some lawyers who are representing some people who are known to have been investigated by this thing, that they indicate they're readying the defense just in case also.
I think that additionally in this this case, the lawyer for Mr. Romer has suggested that there's been too many leaks and media stories, John. Isn't that a part of his defense?
Yes.
To people like you.
To people like you.
To people like me.
No, I understand. You were named in the suit?
No. It's just a motion to dismiss because the government was engaged in reprehensible, massive leaks to the news media before, during, and after the grand jury proceedings, that there was, in fact, pressure on the grand jury to indict and this sort of thing. He's asked for a hearing and asked the court either to dismiss the charges or to hold the government in contempt of court for releasing these things. And it's possible that we will get into a very real issue here of confidentiality of reporters' sources. As we all know, we have confidential sources whom we never name on news stories. We have a very real chance of being subpoenaed and put on the stand and asked who the sources of news stories. Could litigate that all the way up to the Supreme Court, too.
Of course, this same issue is, I guess, being discussed also in the ad scam business in Washington. And it's become, I suppose, we always hear about trial in the press, and it's something that is
well, it's a legitimate issue. I mean, you have the rights of the defendants on one hand and the rights of the news media on the other. And in this case, they're probably contradictory.
I have noticed, though, that Mr. Romer, who was indicted, has been quite evident around the Capitol. We have all talked with him at some point or another. Bob, I know you and I have done some interviews. He certainly hasn't gone into hiding about it, and he's really talked about it a good bit.
Talks about it all the time. He's been around the Capitol. Well, he went into hiding the day he was indicted. Nobody could find him that day. But he was at the Capitol the very next day. And if there's some concern about leaks and people talking about the investigation and prejudicing the court case, he apparently is not concerned about it because he's quite willing to talk about it.
Haven't they now issued a gag order?
No. That is not correct. It is not a gag order. It is a minute entry entered into the court record by Judge Sear, reminding the attorneys of the local court rule number 7 or so, which says you should not make statements to the news media which would prejudice the judge or a jury. So, in effect, this entry tells the lawyers, you guys are playing this game in the media, and here's this court rule. Now, let's remember that. And it was not a gag order. You did not tell them, do not talk to newspaper reporters. It was incorrectly reported as a gag order.
John, how much attention is there on this case, in terms of media coverage? Are there a lot of people, or does it seem to be more of a local interest? Or you write for a wire.
No.
You just send stories all over the country. Has there been interest in it elsewhere?
I really have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I know that stories are running in other newspapers, particularly where the ad scam or similar, FBI sting operations have been underway. But as far as how that's being played elsewhere, I don't know. The networks have shown up a couple of times at the grand jury, but only when the big stars of Louisiana politics have been before the grand jury. Most of the time, it's just the New Orleans and the statewide news media. And it's a regional thing. I think he's playing in Texas and wherever
it goes up
BriLab's
and down, depending on, you know, hardly anyone did a BriLab story on a spot news basis, on a day-to-day basis, between the time that Edwards, Fitzmaurice, and all of these people appeared before the grand jury and then the time the indictments came down. Now there's like a new wave of interest among the media in general because people have been indicted, and I'm sure that that will all diminish, and then when the case goes to court, there will be a great deal of media interest in it again.
Sure.
And I think, too, the fact that Carlos Marcello was among those people indicted has made it very interesting all over because he's a very mysterious,
good
colorful.
Card.
Oh, yes,
right.
yes. It's a great
Yes,
copy. Yeah.
yes.
But he did make Time magazine, and it was read out on the
Newsweek.
national Newsweek, and it was made Newsweek, and it was read out on the national television news broadcasts. You know, so yeah, I'd say there's going to be some interest in it.
Well, there's going to be some interest, I'm certain, as we go to the final day of the session, to July 14th at midnight, and we'll probably all be there at midnight.
On the steps with
on
champagne.
The steps. to end the final days of the session, and perhaps at that point in time, I think Edgar Moutons, who's executive counsel to Governor Treen, said, I think you're going to be surprised. I mean, of course, he's supposed to be optimistic. You're going to be surprised at what we end up passing, and we'll be back again to discuss what, in fact, they did do. I thank all of you for being with me. But first, this update on the BriLab trial now underway in New Orleans. It was 10 months ago that the story first surfaced, that the FBI had filmed and recorded an alleged bribery scheme that involved a top state official and a reputed mafia boss. Among those indicted were former Commissioner of Administration to Edwin Edwards, Charles Romer, and reputed underworld boss Carlos Marcello. This week, as the trial for the men began, defense attorneys tried to attack the credibility of the government's chief witness, Joseph Hauser. We have a report from Charles Ziwi in New Orleans.
Defense attorneys had tried for 2 days to prove Joseph Hauser was so heavily medicated when he joined the investigation that he could not legally have consented to making the tape recordings for the government. Since those tapes were later used as the basis for numerous government wiretaps on Marcello and other defendants, the whole prosecution's case probably would have collapsed if Judge Sear had ruled them inadmissible. But Judge Sear denied a defense motion to quash those tape recordings made by informant Hauser. Hauser, a convicted insurance swindler, is expected to be the government's key witness when the case goes to trial in February. A more important challenge to the government's case came in a defense motion that the wiretaps and electronic bugs placed in Marcello's office were put there illegally. Lawyers contended that the government misled the judge who originally signed the wiretap order in February of 1979 by not telling him that Hauser was plea bargaining at the time on an insurance swindling conviction in Phoenix, Arizona. Defense lawyers claim that Hauser was given the option of helping out in the BriLab investigation or going to jail. But on the stand this week, Hauser insisted that he participated freely with no threats from the government, and that the medication he was taking at the time did not impair his judgment. The hearings represented the last attempt by defense attorneys to kill the case before it goes to trial. While the lawyers argued in court, newsmen covering the case were involved in a legal battle of their own. Judge Sear at one point ordered newsmen and spectators from the court because material contained on the tape recordings was judged to be sensitive and might be ruled inadmissible during the trial. News organizations appealed that closure, but the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the judge, and the most important phase of the pretrial hearing was conducted in secret. This is Charles Ziwi in New Orleans.
Federal Judge Maurice Sear is expected to rule on a number of defense motions today, all of those motions aimed at having the government's case dismissed. This week is the federal BriLab trial. After some 18 weeks of legal arguments, the verdict is nearly at hand for the 4 defendants: reputed crime chief Carlos Marcello, former Commissioner of Administration Charles Romer, Washington lobbyist I. Irving Davidson, and New Orleans attorney Vincent Marinello. The defendants are charged under federal anti-racketeering statutes that include conspiracy to bribe public officials to get state insurance business. This trial is a culmination of a year-long FBI undercover probe that featured as its principal character twice convicted insurance man Joseph Hauser as a government informant. This lengthy trial has been a subject for headlines in newspapers across the state for months. With us this week to look behind the headlines are 3 reporters: Bill McMahon with the Baton Rouge Morning Advocate State Times, John Demers of United Press International, and Bill Kreider of the Associated Press. Well, gentlemen, this has been not only a lengthy trial, but in many ways an unusual one. Much of the evidence presented has been in the form of secretly recorded conversations, hours and hours of tapes. John, as you listened to those, were most of them interesting, or were they pretty dull stuff? A lot of them.
Well, I think that it's safe to say in one word that the tapes were fascinating. Now, there were many stretches that were boring, that were not really totally to the point of the case. But the important thing to remember is these are several hours of tapes taken out of thousands of hours that collected full of recipes, full of probably laundry lists, God knows what else. Things that didn't have anything at all to do with BriLab were for the most part weeded out. I think the thing that kept most of us going week after week and playing after playing as each side played the same tapes back and forth to try to paint some different picture on them was that this was really an unadulterated vision of political deal making. You know, we hear about it in Louisiana, we imagine and make jokes about it a lot. But for all the obscenities and the laughter and the threatening kinds of tones that we use once in a while, you know, there was an indisputable reality about these that no amount of joking or no amount of description in books or magazines could ever recreate in quite the same way.
The idea then was this spoke in some ways to what the political system is like in Louisiana, or what campaign fundraising perhaps is like in Louisiana? Was this time perhaps the FBI the partner in the business of politics that just goes on normally?
Well, if it shows what Louisiana is like, I don't think it paints a very good picture. Not a pretty one at all. There was more than one conversation which indicated that, you know, you had, in order to collect money for a campaign, you got to offer something, and that's illegal.
Perhaps the most interesting character to the average person in this trial is Carlos Marcello, who has been mentioned in stories and headlines in Louisiana for years. We always hear alleged mafia boss, reputed crime chieftain. You have been watching this man week after week. What have you found out about him? Is he, as a person, what has he been like during the trial? He's very taciturn, isn't he, Bill?
I wouldn't say taciturn. He certainly is completely innocent of all grammar, and he talks in shorthand almost, you might say. But he certainly makes himself understood. The one thing about the tapes, though, it proves that if you're going to get into stuff like that, if you're going to get into unadulterated politics, or if you're going to get into crime, it's best to brush up on your language and eliminate a lot of those casual obscenities, because, boy, they come out in that courtroom blam, blam, just like shrapnel. And it was one after the other. Everybody except Romer, I would say.
Yeah, Romer
doesn't cut.
several times when he was with a group where the language was being used, and he sort of fell into the mode, but never to the extent that the others did.
And Marcello was severely embarrassed at some point. I remember he covered his face in his hand after one really bad statement, and the jury giggled, and I don't know what that portends, but
you think the jury wasn't as offended?
No, well, they weren't offended, and furthermore, I think they're rather Louisiana-type jury.
Well, it's interesting to recall, too, that of the 300 and something prospective jurors who were questioned, each of them was asked if he would be offended by such words as.
Yeah.
And the first time Judge Sear used some of those words, it was a new experience for everyone, whether you'd been in a courtroom all your life or whether, you know, you just walked in off the street. It was a very strange feeling to have the judge say, what would you think if somebody said? And each of those jurors assured Sear and the attorneys that the verdict would be fair and wouldn't be influenced by obscenity, because of course using curse words is not against the law, and everybody wanted to make sure of that in the beginning.
I think that's the thing that we remember from the Watergate tapes, certainly.
Yes,
that was
they were deleted. In this case, they were not deleted.
There were no expletives deleted.
No.
Well, certainly the sting operation itself. We talked about those secretly recorded conversations. The sting operation launched by the government itself has been under fire, and I know a number of stories have been written about how much money was spent in this effort. Has that also been an underlying current throughout this trial?
That's one of the main defenses.
In the closing argument, without question. Not question.
Joseph Hauser is an utter black villain, and the government is an utter black villain on account of this sting operation. That's what they all lean on.
And carrying that one step further, there's a specter of 1984 being added to this because two attorneys in closing arguments so far have said something that perhaps was inevitable, but they've both said it rather well. That is that if you can bug Carlos Marcello's phone, if you can put microphones in ceilings and photograph people walking out of restaurants and things, who's next? And it is an interesting question. Though the defense's reasons for bringing it up and pounding away at it are as obvious as can be, it is an interesting question. And
they tell the jurors, so you're the cutting edge.
Right.
You can change that.
And Marcello's attorney said next it could be you, or you, pointing. And I believe that even with a lot of instruction, perhaps a lot of legal fine-tuning by the judge's charge, I think that in some way most people will have some of that in the back of their minds in passing judgment right or wrong on what went on in BriLab.
This was an expensive operation, wasn't it? The government spent a great deal of money.
The feds say $74,000
for Hauser
alone. Well, no, that was the entire cost. Well, yeah, that was for Hauser.
That's for Hauser alone?
Yeah.
And
That's
yet,
right.
as many as 50 agents working at one time, 24 hours a day, monitoring bugs from Davidson's office and home in Washington, D.C., from Marcello's home and office in Metairie, and another. The phone's being tapped, and then the bug itself in the ceiling of Marcello's office.
I get the impression from reading the stories in this of this trial that government agents really sort of stumbled into this state insurance quagmire, if you will, that there was an opportunity waiting there to happen, that they weren't really familiar with what was happening with insurance business in Louisiana, and this just happened to come up, that they...
I believe they stumbled into state insurance, but I don't think from the testimony I've heard that they ever stumbled into Marcello. I think Marcello, the government itself indicates
Came looking for Marcello.
They didn't use the word target.
Yes, or one FBI admitted target.
Did it?
Yes. That he was targeted from the start.
From February 5, 1979.
From the time BriLab focused on Louisiana. Before that, it had been dealing with labor unions in California and things like that. But
all it took was for Hauser to say that he knew Marcello.
They forgot about labor unions in California.
And once Marcello was involved, he then introduced a whole realm of political characters in Louisiana. And one of the interesting things is, I guess, is that how many people in politics in Louisiana know Carlos Marcello. Is that something interesting that came out of this trial, Bill?
Well, apparently quite a few know him, but they don't. I know Marcello is rather cagey about that. He on one of the tapes said he passed by Governor Edwards. He knows Edwards, because I looked the other way. He didn't want to embarrass the man he knows that if a politician is seen with him in public, it can be embarrassing to them. It's kind of a funny situation to be in, because he's a sensitive fellow about that sort of thing.
Edwards denies knowing him, or meeting with him directly.
Certainly some names came up in the tapes that were played and in the stories that were reported, such as former Governor John McKithen. Some embarrassing, I think, tapes that came up. He denied, of course, everything that was mentioned about him in the tapes. Did you ever hesitate about writing stories that would then perhaps damage someone else? Did that ever bother you?
We called them.
Yeah,
we called them, hey, your name's been mentioned. Did you?
Well, that was a funny thing. Marcello was griping and saying he gave McKithen $168,000 and the man wouldn't even talk to him. I remember quite well when the McKithen administration was in there, Marcello says he never got a thing. Well, he got a $500,000 levy built out on Churchill Farms and $500,000. It raised considerable protest at the time that the McKithen administration was pushing this.
One of the things that we've also watched is that there are colorful characters involved in this trial. The attorneys themselves have become, I think, significant. What is it like every day in the courtroom there? How many, there are lawyers by the score. Is that right, Bill?
There's 11 or 12 on one side and 5 on the other. And I feel somewhat uncomfortable sometimes because I think that I don't know how you people feel, but I feel like sometimes I'm being courted for good coverage. And
in the hallways.
In the hallways.
Yeah.
I have some resentment, and of course they're also good, they're good sources for information. So there's a two-way street there that you have to play, but there is that kind of thing that goes on.
Well, the hallways are interesting in a lot of ways in this trial. Many times reporters get, when we get corralled by a defense attorney or a prosecuting attorney who's just up for some reason or another, says, how do you think I did? You think that hurt us? You think that helped us? And we're caught in a position of, first off, not really being experts of such things and, and having to speculate, but also not really, even if somebody just made a fool of himself, sometimes it's rather embarrassing to say, well, I think you blew that round or something like that. So it's an uncomfortable situation that way too. And then secondly, to the amazement, I guess, of many people who haven't been around attorneys, it is, while being a mystical, committed cause while in the courtroom, it is at one level a job for them, just a job as well, because in the hallways, they are quite often, chatting and joking, their arms around each other, calling each other, by their first names, and it's hard even to get a last name, out of some of them in the courtroom. So it's kind of an eye-opener at first.
Did the defendants talk to one another?
Oh, well,
they talk to everybody.
Yeah,
they talk to the prosecutors.
The
I mean,
FBI.
this trial has gone on so long that these people all know each other.
I get the feeling that perhaps you are like prisoners captured together in a period of time, and so
I think the ship is overturned.
Until the last 2 days, the press and the defendants and the lawyers and the jury have been about the only people there. Now it's crowded.
There have been many headlines about this trial, but do you get the sense that the public is interested, or because it's gone on so long? Have you gotten much feedback from your stories, Bill?
I think we've bored them in many ways. It's been repetitious. You have both sides playing the same tape, as John said earlier. But it's a very important trial. Some people consider, probably the most important, or at least the most exciting trial probably in this decade. And you have some, when you have Marcello and former Governor Edwards' chief aide, it's an important trial. And I think we have a responsibility to report on it sometime, even for those people who maybe not be reading us.
So you have a sense of commitment or history, if you will?
You think about historians looking at your copy, 15 years from now and writing a story, or a book, or...
That could be even worse than editors looking at your copy.
Hey, there's nothing worse than editors looking at your
In the
copy.
wire viewpoint, though, I think both AP and UPI have felt that we were just spinning our wheels. I don't believe it's getting a lot of coverage outside this immediate area.
Yes, I think that when the indictments were handed down and before that, all the hoorah over the grand jury appearances, each person walking out and being, attacked with microphones and notebooks and things, we all came to expect a lot more interest nationwide, but both wire services have ways of finding out who uses whose story. And not only have we found out that, that the usage varies from service to service, but the usage overall has been very slight. In places, New York, Minnesota, Oregon, it doesn't matter. The interest is not anywhere near what I personally expected in the trial.
But it is, as you said, Bill, an important trial for Louisiana. How significant is it, say, politically?
For Romer, it's like a death knell, I think. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's, the 18 weeks he spent on trial, I don't think the man can recover whether he's acquitted or not.
I'm not sure he wants to get back
Maybe
into
not.
politics.
I wouldn't if I were he.
I mean, I know that's his feeling at the time.
And
also, he's a little hurt, that he should be referred to as the little fish. They told him rather bluntly in testimony and elsewhere that they were after bigger fish than Romer, and I have to wonder who that is. But it was
I don't think it was
obviously
Edwards.
and they didn't get Edwards.
Romer's defense now is interesting. He's saying that he was simply conning the con, that he didn't expect to do anything for the money that was $25,000 that was given to him. He says that it was for Sonny Mouton's campaign for governor. It is interesting to hear him speak because it recounts, I suppose, Governor Edwards said that when he took some money, a campaign contribution from Tenneco, that it may be unethical for him to take it, but he didn't do anything for it, so it wasn't illegal. Is that Do you hear this kind of theme that perhaps that's the way business is done in campaign contributions?
Edward says he's done that many times. He makes large banquet jokes of it and goes over big, but his hasn't become a federal case. In a federal case, they don't smile upon that sort of thing, and whether or not they'll be able to, I think Romer's defenses in the context of Louisiana politics is plausible. The only flaw that he has to contend with is the fact he didn't report this 15. He did tell Mouton about it, though. I mean, it's and the fact that it wasn't reported could have been an accounting bobble. I can't keep track of it. That's a mystery to me, and I can see where it would fall up.
But in the context of Louisiana politics, and it is plausible.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Reasonable doubt is very important to the jury.
Mm-hmm.
Let me pose something out. I haven't talked about this. I just got to thinking the other day, the $10,000 that was supposed to go to Fitzmaurice, Marcello was charged with delivering it. And Fitzmaurice says never offered or neither did he accept it. My question is, does anyone know where the $10,000 is?
That's wonderful.
I've been scratching my head about that. I want to know who has the $10,000, and I don't know the answer.
The indictment and the case track it right up to, and stops.
Well, that's one of those questions, and maybe they come back and get you on not reporting income, perhaps an IRS charge, if they find out who has it. There have been many interesting sidebar stories to this trial. I don't know whether it's because you've run out of things to write about, but or at the trial itself, but that have been interesting. I think, Bill, you did one on the restaurants where Carlos Marcello ate and his conversations were recorded. Were those some of the interesting things to this trial?
Carl Redmond, he and I have been working together. I don't think we were pulling a scam on our employee, on our employer, but our meals were paid for, however, by them. But we just explored the atmosphere. We thought, hey, what do you do at night after you get through writing a story in New Orleans? Well, you go eat. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to go eat, why not go eat where Marcello ate?
And you find that lots of business from these conversations was transacted at restaurants, at hotels, and places like that.
One of the tapes that was played at Impastados was almost impossible to hear because of the noise, and there was Italian music in the background, and a great tape, but everybody would just...
Marcello, incidentally, was quite pleased by that. He says he ought to charge those people for advertising. I suppose he should.
How important is this trial for U.S. Attorney John Volz?
You cover him regularly.
I think it has a lot to do with whether or not he keeps this job, or even if he has any designs on district attorney, and some people think he has. New Orleans district attorney, that is.
So in that sense, it's politically significant.
Yes,
also.
it is for him. He certainly put everything into it too. He spent a lot of time on this thing.
He's not been absent.
One of the interesting figures who is no longer a defendant, perhaps we should mention, is Aubrey Young, who was originally indicted and stood trial along with these gentlemen, but the judge dismissed it. Was there a sense of, yes, that was right after you were listening to, was he a little fish caught up in the net, or did he just manage to wiggle out legally?
Well, probably a little bit of both. I believe that but legally, first off, he shouldn't have been there. I think the judge was right in doing that, and I'm sure he knows far more than I do, and he thought he was right in doing it. But all through, there was a real sense to me that Young was, not just taking orders in the sense that we've come to look at people and say that's just an excuse, but wasn't really always, or was seldom in the know about things. The judge himself used the analogy in dismissing the charges against Young that two men involved in a business deal, legitimate, illegitimate, whatever, can have their secretaries make phone calls, write letters, do things, and the men can be held responsible. But if the secretaries are just secretaries, they can't be. And I think that was, the final word, at least for BriLab and the federal charges on Aubrey Young, is that the judge at least thought that Aubrey Young was just a secretary in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Aubrey, I think, is basically a kindly man who has a great deal of difficulty saying no to somebody.
I suppose another interesting gentleman who is still a defendant is I. Irving Davidson, a name that is not familiar, such as Carlos Marcello or Charlie Romer, but a man who has a very interesting past. You've written some stories about him, Bill.
I think Davidson basically is a rogue and in many ways a sort of a scoundrel, but he's a delightful rogue and scoundrel.
Very likable fellow. They're all likable. Marcello's likable. I you know, after you've been around him for a while, I don't know what that does to a jury.
Maybe I should be bold to suggest you've been down there and covering the trial too long.
Maybe you should.
Well, there is something perhaps a little bit deeper than just our own losing our minds over covering BriLab, and several attorneys have suggested that in a deeper way, the trial has removed some of the stigma, some of the aura of unapproachability about Marcello. You know, we've heard him talk, we've heard him worry about things, about all the little details of life, and humans can be criminals, but they can also not be. But the main thing is that he has become much more human than ever before.
Certainly he can make mistakes. He wasn't very good at predicting who would win the governor's race in Louisiana.
He didn't come anywhere near it.
No. Was that a surprise to you that he didn't?
Yes, it was. I thought he was a little dumb about politics, as a matter of fact, for a man with his reputation. But he still comes across, and this is important for him, I think. He comes across as a rather nice fellow. He scoured up goat's milk for Hauser, the man who was doing all this to him, because Hauser had a bleeding ulcer, and things like that. He didn't argue with Swegman. You remember when John Swegman, John is sick, the old man, and his son had changed to, what, Republican? Anyhow, he had changed his political stand completely, and Marcello says, well, he just listened, and he didn't try to change anything because, it could bring on heartache. These things, you don't expect to hear things like that somehow or another from Marcello, and in that respect, he has come on as a different character than people think.
What are your impressions of Joseph Hauser, the government informant, who has, of course, been convicted in the past? He is also an interesting character.
I thought he was an effective witness, but I know there are other people who didn't think he was.
I thought he was.
I thought you were on the other side.
I think the defense was somewhat shocked as how good he was.
Yeah.
They thought they could break him down. They really thought that he would become a real ogre once he got on the stand. And if he was an ogre, he wasn't as big a one as they thought he would be.
Perhaps we should give a little of his background. He has been involved in schemes in the past, and so when he came, these gentlemen already knew him.
Oh, yes. But that was the key to the success of BriLab. No doubt about that. Marcello knew him, and Davidson brought the man. He knew him. And if these other two people had showed up without Joseph Hauser, they wouldn't have got to see Marcello or Davidson, either one, I suppose. Nobody would have paid any attention to them whatsoever. But Hauser was there. He brought them right in just as smooth as cream. He was good. I'll have to say that. Whatever they may think of him, he did some of the best undercover work that has been done by the FBI.
And they really needed someone like this to get in.
Yes, he was absolutely.
What about the FBI agents themselves? Of course,
very good. Very good.
Did they practice long? Did you get the impression to be posing as they did?
I don't think they practiced very long at all. I think they sort of winged it.
I think they did too, and I thought they were exceedingly smart operators. At least everything that came out in the trial, I didn't see anything that made them look dumb. Well, some of the remarks they made, if they were looking flat out for conviction, were
waxed at the time, but was not as aware as he should have been, I don't think.
And mine too.
Finally, well, gentlemen, do you think that the trial is going to be wrapped up fairly shortly? Are we looking at a long jury deliberation? It's difficult to make predictions, I know, but we're close now to the end of the trial. Do you see it running long? The jury has a lot of information to examine. They have a lot of, I would imagine, instructions from the judge they're going to have to go over. Is it going to take a long time?
Midweek?
Perhaps. This may be stating the obvious, but I think it comes down to how they go about it. If they go along with a point-by-point, count-by-point, quote-by-quote, discussion, it could take God knows how long. But some of the attorneys are thinking that they may go with impressions. They may go with, well, I don't think this was right, or I think this was wrong. And in that case, it might not take too long at all.
Well, gentlemen, we won't know this week, but we will next week. I thank you for being with us on the show tonight, and we'll be back next week on Louisiana, the state we're in, with another edition, and we hope that you'll join us then. I'm Beth George. Good night.